maybe, maybe the writing part isn't something that you're going to be able to do that much. Maybe you're going to have a lot more oral testing with that student. I had a student named Andre who was just a delight, had picked up on oral English so quickly. I mean, he understood sarcasm and humor, and he would play jokes on people really, really quickly within a couple months of being in the US. And even after a year and a half of being in the US, his reading and writing skills were very, very low. Andre had been, he was from Moldova, a farming community in Moldova, and every third week since he was 6 years old, he would take the village's sheep to pasture. I'm not kidding. So imagine that. Imagine missing every third week of school from kindergarten to 8th grade. It's kind of a lot of school. And so he got to the US, and even his reading and writing skills and his language were not very high. And so he really relied on his oral language skills to learn in school. And what we figured out is that this kid could repeat everything a teacher said pretty much, or summarize it for you, but as soon as you put a piece of paper in front of him, shut down completely. And so we depended a lot more on oral assessment in his subject area classes. Did we work on reading and writing? Absolutely, but maybe not so much in math class or science or social studies. And so he did a lot of contract grading with his teachers, saying, you know what, I know that I'm not going to be able to write this 5-page paper because I can hardly write a sentence. So how else can I show you that I know what you want me to know? So I encourage you to think about that. So just a number of other strategies for you. Questions or comments so far on that? Okay. In terms of thinking about question strategies, I think that this is a really important thing to think about, that a lot of times we don't recognize, I guess, kind of the complexity of questions that we ask students. And oftentimes that's great, it's part of our rigorous curriculum, but that can be really confusing sometimes for English language learners. And so I encourage you to really think about the way that you ask them questions, how you ask them questions, and the kinds of questions that you ask them. One particular example is, especially with beginners, is embedding the answer to a question within the question. And so instead of saying something like, describe a penguin, or describe the type of being that a penguin is, you can ask a student, is a penguin a mammal or a bird? And right there, the student will know it's either a mammal or a bird. And they still have to rely on their understanding, their conceptual understanding, to figure that out. But they don't have to try to think of all the possible answers, do translation in their head, or rely on other strategies. And I found that to be particularly helpful for students, especially if you want them to participate in class. And so another example would be, if you're reading a passage in class, what was the boy's emotion? We might read a small passage to our class and say, what was the boy's emotion? And for an English language learner, that might be a really complicated question. But if you were to say, was the boy scared or angry? That student might be able to say, okay, he's scared or he's angry. I have a 50-50 shot here. What do I know about anger? Angry people sometimes throw things. The boy was throwing things. I'd say angry. That cuts down right there all of those things that have to happen if they have minimal language skills. Any other questions or comments that you can think of?
I have one. So a skeptic may look at that and say, but now we're giving everybody a 50-50 chance of getting the right answer, so maybe there's a 50-50 chance of whether or not the kid understands.
There is a 50-50 chance. And I think that's something that you're going to run into with anything that you're doing. So the fact that you can minimize what has to happen helps with not just the kid might or might not know the answer, but just their general well-being as a student in your classroom. It's so important for English language. It's important for everybody, but it's important, especially important for English language learners, to feel successful in academic settings. A lot of times they can manage the social, but for them to feel successful in an academic setting is so important. And so to minimize some of that tension, if they know, okay, my teacher has a rule, she calls on everybody during the hour, at least I know my teacher's going to ask me a question that I have a shot at answering correctly in the classroom.
Are there, because you were saying a lot of the time just having like verbal tests and talking through what they know, are there ever times where students, it would be better for them to actually have a test in front of them? Because I feel like when I was learning Spanish, I would love when there was writing and taking the test, but as soon as we had that like test and we had to talk to a teacher, I'd freak out.
Sure, and maybe that will be better for a student, and I think that really involves getting to know them. If they're a student who has experience and has a grade level reading and writing skill that matches a little closer to the grade you're teaching, that might be a much more viable option than somebody who's in 10th grade, 15 years old, reads at a second grade reading level. And for Andre specifically, the example I gave you before, for him, it wasn't that he couldn't read and write anything, it was just the intimidation factor. Like he got so freaked out that he just shut down. And so really working through that with him around the fear of reading and writing was something that worked for him, where he could participate conceptually in 10th grade, but we had to work on that reading and writing. But there might be students like the shy student I was telling you about who didn't like to say anything to anybody. He struggled through reading and writing at that grade level because he would rather do that than talk to people. And so it's really getting to know that student. And I think that that's a great example that for you really would have liked to have, something that you could see. So it really just kind of depends on the student. Yeah. Oh.
Well, I don't know if this is a fair question. I don't have any ELL students, so I don't know if this is really something that comes up a lot, but I don't know, this seems like ethically ungenerous maybe, but do ELL students ever, or is there ever a problem with them not letting on that they know as much as they know? Or is it pretty much that they're working so hard to learn the English that they want to show that they learn it?
That's a great question.
It is a great question,
That's a great question.
I do have some stories actually. So this is my experience, and I don't know that it's a textbook answer. It's my experience. So I did have some students like that. So I had one particular student named Francisco. He was everything, like he tried to present himself as much as possible as like gangsta boy, so like his pants were down, he like walked, but like he try to talk kind of in this, like the raps he heard on TV, which actually was hilarious because it just didn't match up, but whatever. He was in 9th grade, and bright kid. I mean, like totally could be like a nuclear physicist engineer or something. I mean, really intelligent, but it wasn't cool to seem intelligent with his friends. I think that you find that with mainstream students as well, where, so he would be in a group, we'd be working on something, or even with his social studies or his science teacher, he'd be like, I don't know, and so, I mean, yeah, that definitely can happen, but again, I knew that, his teachers, because we knew him, and so we knew that a lot of that for him was just a facade. Are there students who can pull one over on you? Absolutely. And that's going to happen to you sometime in your teaching career, whether it's an ESL student or not. So, sure, students can do that. But I think when you get to know a student, I think that people who have been, you've had experience now, you'll continue to have experience, you can kind of figure out, okay, is this a show? Is there something else going on here where a student isn't, willing to necessarily engage with you on that level? So yeah, that was such a struggle for me with Francisco specifically, because he knew the answer. He knew the answer to like everything. He knew way more than I knew. But when he was with anybody else, there was no way that was going to come through. It didn't matter. Come on, I know you know this. You got on your test. No, I didn't. And so that was something where I knew he. And it got to a point where he started purposefully failing tests, because he didn't want his friends to know that he was so smart, because that wasn't cool. And so having to have real conversations with him about, okay, all your friends aren't going to be, living with you the rest of your life and judging whether you're cool or not, to learn these things in order to get where you want to be. So, sure, the answer is sure, it happens. But hopefully as a teacher you can differentiate that.